there's still people coming in, so I think we'll give it like another minute or two, and then we'll kick off. Tam, should we start, you think?
Yes, please. That's great. I've just made you co-hosts, so I think you should be able to share this.
And are all the panelists co-hosts as well, so they can share screens and things?
Yep, Kate, Andy and Tess, all co-hosts.
All right, brilliant. Welcome everybody to what must be the most appropriate weather for a topic ever, I think. So tonight we're discussing tackling climate change, and we're not at the LSE because it's too hot, and we didn't want to make everyone travel on the trains. So we're going to try and see if we can find solutions to this heat wave. Obviously not this particular heat wave, but the general existential threat of climate change. And we've got an amazing panel talking about this topic today. Andy Russell from Queen Mary's, Catherine Higham from LSE, and Tess Sokol-Sachs from the Transition Pathways Institute. And I'm guessing we're going to speak in that order. We haven't discussed order, but if that's all right with everybody, that's the order we'll do it. So just to remind everybody of the format, so our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have questions. If we use the chat for questions, and you can start posting those whenever a thought strikes you, but we'll start collecting them all. I'll collect them all, and we'll address them to the panel after we've heard each person speak. So Andy, with no further ado, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share some slides. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes, we can. See them perfectly.
Brilliant. Okay, well, firstly, thanks for inviting me to speak. This is really exciting. And secondly, well done on making the switch to a virtual meeting. When I used to work at the Committee on Climate Change, on climate change adaptation, it was difficult to convince people to do things differently when there were risks or problems caused by some sort of climate change impact. So yeah, really good to see that this event and lots of other things are starting to get the message that we are susceptible to climate changes and we need to do things differently. So the topic of my 10 minutes or so is about mostly climate change science, how we got here and where we're heading. But before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I got here, because the Next Step Foundation looks really good, and I wish something like this existed when I was at school. So I am from Dover, which is a fairly deprived coastal town. I went to a not very good school, and thinking back, I don't think I ever really heard about universities until I was about 15 or 16. I was the first person in my family to go to university. It is a big step. It's a big thing. So I think having something to help you on your way is really good. So I thought I'd go a little bit through my journey, just in case that sparks any questions and where I've been in my career. So I firstly read physics at Imperial College London, which was very hard, and then quickly moved into something a little bit more easy. And I did a master's in environmental science, mathematical modeling of environmental systems, which led me on to do a PhD at the University of Birmingham with the British Antarctic Survey. So I did things on atmospheric modeling and linking that to ice cores and understanding long-term past climate changes. And then when I finished my PhD, I did a postdoc in Manchester looking at convective storms. So I wasn't quite a storm chaser, but we spent quite a few summers sitting around waiting for storms to hit us and taking measurements of how they develop and how that might change in the future under climate changes. And then when I was, in my late 20s, early 30s, I would have got my first permanent job as a lecturer at Brunel University in London, where I was developing my own research projects and teaching environmental sciences. And I did that for about 7 years, and then felt, I'm doing all this science, but I don't really know where it goes. So I decided to leave academia, leave universities, and go into the civil service, so working for the government, supporting their actions. And I held a number of roles, most excitingly at the Committee on Climate Change, which is an awesome organisation of really clever, fun people who criticise and assess the government's actions on climate changes. So yeah, they're really well respected in the media, in the Houses of Lords, the Houses of Commons, all over. That was an awesome job. And I also worked in DEFRA and BEIS, and then thought, well, I'd love to come back to universities now and apply what I've learned to the science that I knew before. So bridging this sort of science policy interface. So I'm now a lecturer at Queen Mary University, doing that on sort of climate science and flood risk. So back to what I was going to talk about, climate change. So firstly, how did we get here? How long have we known that climate change is a problem? So if we were in a room, I would have asked you to shout out and we would have talked about all the different answers. But given that we're not, I'll just dive straight in. So I think we can go back to around the 1850s when we first knew that climate change was going to be a problem. There was this scientist called Eunice Newton-Foote, who was a distant relative of Isaac Newton, who published this paper on the circumstances affecting the heat of the sun's rays. And she did this brilliant experiment where she had these two cylinders, and this is a recreation of that, where you could change the concentration of gases in those cylinders and then shine sunlight on them and see what happened to the temperature within the cylinders. So at that point, no one knew about greenhouse gases and how the atmosphere worked in this kind of thermal way. And she did these experiments and found out that carbon dioxide had a really big impact on the temperature. And she didn't really look forward and think, well, what would happen if we changed the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? But she did look backwards and say, well, we knew that the Earth was warmer and colder at different periods in the past. And she supposed that was because of changes in the atmospheric composition. And she was not far from the truth in that. When did we start thinking about this being a problem in the future? Well, we can go back, well, even before Eunice Newton-Foote. So a mathematician called Fourier from France started doing the maths around the greenhouse effect. So why is the Earth warmer than we would expect it to be if it were just a ball of rock orbiting the sun? And he started to work out how the transmission of radiation through the atmosphere could be affected by the composition of the gases, and started to work out mathematically why we're warmer than we might otherwise be. And then Tyndall, an Irish scientist, did similar experiments to Eunice Newton-Foote, but in a lot more detail, and he's a lot more famous than Eunice Newton-Foote. And Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist, was the first one to start looking thought experiments about what might happen with the climate if, say, we doubled CO2 concentration. So there, by the end of the 19th century, we had really all the different bits of the puzzle we needed to work out that this was going to be a problem. Although at that point, Arrhenius thought it would be a benefit, it would be a good thing. And then we can go through the 20th century where we start to observe warming in the atmosphere. Keeling started to measure atmospheric CO2 concentration in the mid 20th century. There's a really famous graph that you might have seen where the CO2 goes up, sort of oscillating a little bit per year, but there's a positive trend all the way through. And then our first climate models started appearing in the 60s. where we could make mathematical projections of climate using a knowledge of the physical system. And then in the 90s, we see the birth of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where there was a real global effort to bring our best knowledge of science together to make predictions of what might happen to societies and people and biospheres and that sort of thing. Of interest, the IPCC won the Nobel Peace Prize in the, I think, 2008, 2009, not too sure. Manabe won the Nobel Prize for Physics a couple of years ago. So this field is becoming really well respected as a science, as well as its sort of roots in geography. So there have been some successes in the way that science and politics and policies have interacted, and there's some examples here. So in the top left, you can see the Earth Summit from 1992, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed. And this started the process of the COP meetings, the Conference of the Parties. You might remember that COP26 was in Glasgow last year. And that has achieved some things. We had something called the Kyoto Protocol, where most of the nations of the world agreed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions a little bit. And then we had the Paris Agreement, which is the main photo on this slide from 2015, where countries agreed to start to do as much as they could to bring down their greenhouse gas emissions. So those are international successes. And domestically within the UK, we have something called the Climate Change Act, which was the first legally binding approach by a developed nation to reduce greenhouse gases and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And that little graph there shows some progress that we've made over the years. So there are some successes, but there have been some big failures as well. So these are three photos from Conference of the Parties meetings. The one on the right, the guy who's crying there is Ivo de Boer, who broke down in tears at the end of the Conference of the Parties in 2007 in Bali, because he failed to get an agreement to follow on from the Kyoto Protocol, so we could really push forward with greenhouse gas reductions. The top right, top left up here, sorry, this is the 2009 COP from Copenhagen. Again, members distraught, crying at the failure to get a follow-up to the Kyoto Protocol, which eventually happened 6 years later in Paris. So we lost like between 9 and 6 years of action for the delays of following on from the Kyoto Protocol caused by our inability to agree things at these COP meetings. And down the bottom left here, that's Alok Sharma, who was the president of COP26, again, breaking down in tears at the end of the meeting when he failed to get an agreement to phase out coal. He was stymied right at the end of that meeting by a couple of nations who changed the wording to phase down, which is essentially meaningless. So the last slide I want to show is kind of where we're going. So this is something called the Climate Action Tracker, which is an awesome collection of science and projections that tries to show where we might end up in the year 2100 based on different assumptions about what governments are going to do with their policies. So we've got these 4 different bars here that show the average temperature we're likely to meet in 2100 based on an optimistic scenario, based on whether pledges and targets are fully implemented, and whether targets out to 2030 are implemented, and what happens if these things that have only been written into law at the moment are implemented. So there's a huge range from around 3.6 degrees to 1.5. The latter is kind of what we're aiming for. With the Paris Agreement, the upper end would not necessarily be catastrophic, but would involve a lot of adaptation for our systems to cope with that. So I'm an optimistic person, and I think that we can get down to this end of the scale. We've shown that we can succeed in international negotiations. And I think we are starting to see the real world impacts of climate change, such as our heat wave throughout Europe at the moment. And I think the momentum building from from those impacts being seen by world leaders will hopefully get us nearer this optimistic end than the other end of the scale. So I will finish there. Hopefully I didn't go too far over my allotted 10 minutes, but I'll hand over to the chair.
Great, thanks, Andy. That was, I mean, amazing to end on an optimistic note. We've done climate change as a topic every year, and it very rarely ends optimistically. So that was great. So let's hand over now to Catherine, or Kate rather. Which do you prefer? Kate?
Oh, Kate, yeah.
Okay, right, great.
Great, so I'm not going to share my slides immediately because like Andy, I normally start this kind of presentation with a question to all of you. And the way that I've found that's best to do that in this kind of virtual setting is by asking you all to turn on your cameras. I've got you all on gallery view, and I'm going to ask you to answer my question. And if the answer is like a little bit, I want you to hold your hands here. If it's like a fair amount here, and if it's you know, really something significant up here. And what I want to ask about, and what I want to talk about a little bit to begin with today is climate anxiety and questions about how people are feeling in the face of some of the science that Andy has just walked us through, and some of the newspaper articles and stories that you hear time and again about, you know, how we've broken another record for heat wave, for example, today, perfect example, or how nations have failed to agree what they would need to agree to achieve our global goals and things. So if you don't mind turning on your videos, I'm going to ask you to give me that response. How many of you have ever been kind of worried about climate change, have ever thought about this as something that's concerning, particularly when you're thinking about your futures and universities and things like that? So I've got a thumbs up from someone. I've got a guy up there, me, I'm very high up. Got another thumbs up. Okay, I'm not seeing any thumbs downs right now on my screen. So I'm going to share my screen at this point, and I'm going to start by, oh crap, I'm not going to share my screen, hang on. Bear with me one moment. Because of the heat wave, I've had to use a different computer to the one I normally use. So I have to give Zoom permission, I think, to record my screen. There we go. Apparently it's telling me it can't share content until I quit. So maybe, sorry about this, everybody. It's the peril of changing things at the last minute. Maybe we can hand over to Tess and I can come back at the end.
Yeah, good idea. You log out and come back, and we'll carry on. So Tess, are you ready?
Sorry about that, everyone.
Oh yeah. Okay, well, I think I'll jump into my slides if I quickly share them. Okay. Alrighty, everybody see them? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll just start off with an introduction of myself too. So my name is Tess, and I'm a researcher at the Transition Pathway Initiative, which sits at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. And my background is primarily in like climate finance, and I've just recently come over working in academia. I started off working at Deloitte in their sustainability consulting practice, working with corporates on their sustainability reporting and strategy, and then just finished my master's at LSE in 2021, and then started working at the Transition Pathway Initiative, where we're assessing companies on their progression towards the energy transition and their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement goals. So it's been definitely a shift from going into the private sector into more academia, which I've really enjoyed a lot. But yeah, I can talk more about that if students are interested in hearing about it. So I think where I wanted to start was with just a broad overview of kind of the science, climate science, not as in-depth as Andy's presentation, but just some context that underpins some of the work I do and how corporates fit into the bigger picture of an economy-wide transition. So as Andy mentioned, one of the most significant international agreements on climate has been the Paris Agreement. And one of the most important contributions of the Paris Agreement was this strengthened temperature target of keeping temperature rise limited to 1.5 degrees. And the previous agreement, the Copenhagen Accord, had introduced this temperature limit of 2 degrees, and the Paris Agreement stretched it up to that stretch target of 1.5. I think that's when it was first introduced, that 2 degree target, but Andy, you can jump in if I'm wrong. So this temperature rise target has a lot of implications for what needs to happen to emissions up to 2050. So climate research has come a long way in showing that there's a linear relationship between cumulative carbon dioxide emissions and temperature increase. So in other words, 1 ton of carbon dioxide emitted today or yesterday or 50 years ago will lead broadly to the same amount of warming. And any amount of carbon dioxide emissions leads to some level of warming. So what the carbon budget tells us is the maximum amount of carbon dioxide that can be emitted to stabilize warming to a particular level. And we know now there's international agreement that we want to stabilize emissions at 1.5 degrees ideally. So this carbon budget is a finite amount, which is, as you can see from this graph, it's the area under the curve. So each year that kind of translates into an annual amount that you can sum together to get a cumulative amount of emissions that can be emitted until that temperature increase is breached. And if you want to stabilize warming, emissions from carbon dioxide specifically need to go to zero, because CO2 specifically lasts a really long time in the atmosphere. So there are other implications for other greenhouse gas emissions like methane and nitrous oxide. Those obviously need to decrease and flatten out and stabilize, but it's a bit more clear for carbon dioxide that needs to go to zero. So from this graph, you can see this is a graph from the Carbon Brief that kind of their own analysis based on IPCC's most recent AR6 report, where they found that carbon dioxide needs to reach net zero by 2040 to maintain a temperature limit of 1.5 degrees and around 2060 to maintain a well below 2 degrees. And something to keep in mind about these is that there's a lot of uncertainty and that these projections are all probabilistic. So it's still it's a probability distribution about how much warming will happen as a result of 1 ton of carbon dioxide being emitted. And a lot of that uncertainty comes from what happens to other non-CO2 emissions, such as methane, as I mentioned, and especially with feedback as well. So you can end up having warming that happens when something really drastic happens, like if all the permafrost were to melt in Siberia and that would release a methane bomb, that would throw a lot more emissions into the atmosphere than climate scientists were initially imagining when they modeled this climate budget right now, carbon budget. So I think the bottom line really is that the greater chance of meeting the budget, you need a smaller amount of carbon dioxide that can be emitted. And so also something to note on this slide, when I give the approximate range of 400 to 17 gigatons of CO2 that can be released as the remaining carbon budget, that would be so that the world would have a 50-50 chance of maintaining within the 1.5 degree target. And interestingly, there's also approximately 1 in 6 chance that the remaining carbon budget for a 1.5 degree scenario has already been exceeded. So it's just to show that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of different ways to view that idea of a carbon budget. So next slide. This is another implication of what the carbon budget. So this means that there's a large amount of fossil fuel resources that are approved or probable reserves that must stay in the ground and not be burned for energy. So this graph shows 4 different fossil fuels, so oil, gas, coal, and lignite. And the darker orange is approved reserves, and the lighter orange is probable. And then in the green bar is the remaining carbon budget, with the lighter green showing the range of uncertainty with how much carbon budget we have to stay within a 2-degree temperature limit. So this really illustrates very clearly that the amount of fossil fuels that we have accessible to us that we can burn, if we did burn those, that would far exceed our carbon budget. Even if we just burned all of the coal that we have left, that would already exceed a 2-degree temperature limit. So I think that is the main takeaway here. So then, I guess, what does this mean? Where does corporations come into this picture, and what does that mean for the economic activity that's taking place in that part of the economy, or the global economy? So one of the main reasons why corporations have been getting a lot of attention in this discussion of the low carbon transition is because they are a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. Some of the biggest fossil fuel companies have contributed a large share of historical greenhouse gases, in particular fossil fuel companies, obviously, that produce themselves oil, gas, and coal. And secondly, they're also very politically influential, so they can lobby to influence policy to be slower moving and not be as ambitious. They also can supply low carbon products. So an example of Tesla, where that's providing electric vehicles, which are a critical component of achieving the low carbon transition. So they can also be part of the solution in terms of different opportunities that arise from creating low carbon products. And then lastly, there's been a shift in recent years to focus on these non-state actors, since governments and policy at the national government level moves very slowly. So a lot of climate activists have been frustrated with that slow pace of UN climate negotiations and want to put more pressure on corporations where, in theory, change can happen more quickly. So that brings me to, how do we measure corporates' actions, and how do we measure the progress that's being made by this section of the economy? And so that's where the Transition Pathway Initiative, where I currently work, has really tried to offer a tool to measure this progress. So we assess the world's highest emitting public companies on their transition to a low carbon economy in 2 different ways. One through their management quality, and one through carbon performance. So management quality, we look at how a company manages their greenhouse gas emissions and the risks and opportunities that arise from the transition. And then the quantitative side, look at their carbon performance. So looking at how the company's emissions pathways will measure up against international climate goals. So the emissions that are implied from a 1.5 degree scenario, for example. And these 2 are largely complementary. So we can view management quality as like the input of a company. What are they doing to manage emissions? And then carbon performance, on the other hand, is more of like the output. So what are they actually emitting? So this is where it could get fun. So if you guys are interested in certain companies, I think if you want to see how a certain company is performing in terms of their carbon emissions and their carbon management, we can look at them on the TPI website. But if there's not a keen interest, I can talk about some of my favorite, most interesting cases on the slide.
Thanks, Tess. I actually can't wait to dig into some of this because there's some obvious names there that would be worth challenging, I think, what they're doing. But we'll turn back to Kate, who I think is able to show her slides.
Let's hope so. Fingers crossed for more success. I think I have to wait for Tess to stop sharing. And then, yes, I can do it. Look at that. It's a modern miracle. So sorry again for the delay there. And as I said at the start, one of the things I wanted to talk about a bit today is climate anxiety. So we've established, I think, from your responses to my question, that at some stage many of us, if not most of us, have felt really concerned about what is happening to the planet around us. And certainly today, I've been feeling that more than ever in this heat wave. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate anxiety. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that some corporations, not all corporations, but some corporations have played in perpetuating and promoting narratives that cause that anxiety. And then I'm going to talk about action that people, particularly young people around the world, are taking, and the way that that can act as a bit of an antidote to climate anxiety. And my sort of lens on this is I'm a lawyer by training. I used to do human rights law, lots of kind of big strategic litigation cases. So those are the ones where we do a lot of press releases about what we're doing, and we try and influence more than just the judges in kind of determining the outcome of a case. And I come to this topic of climate change kind of through that lens. And so at the end, I'll talk particularly about climate change litigation and the way in which people are challenging big emitters, whether that's governments or companies, through the courts. So just to kick us off, I mean, this is fairly obvious, but what is climate anxiety? Well, there are a number of different ways in which it's been defined. It can be defined as kind of fear, stress, or worry, stemming from a sense of impending climate change impacts and processes. Uncertainty plays a really big role, and you often hear people talk about environmental doom. A fear of experiencing first-hand climate-related disasters. And importantly, that can be something that affects different communities and different people differently. One of the issues we know is that the impacts of climate change are felt disproportionately around the world. So while we may all be, feeling the effects of this heat wave, because of the infrastructure we have here in the UK, and because we are relatively, and I say relatively, well prepared to deal with it, it's not necessarily impacting on us the same way as it might be if we were experiencing temperatures this high or higher elsewhere in the world. And one of the things that scientists from the Lancet have discovered is that around 45% of children and young people around the world feel the impacts of climate anxiety on a daily basis, and it's having a really negative effect on their lives. So this is clearly a big public health crisis, just thinking about the mental health implications of climate change, as well as, of course, the potential physical impacts on people's health. And one of the reasons that so many people feel, unlike Andy, who knows a lot about this subject, one of the reasons that people feel hopeless and feel that anxiety and feel kind of this sense of doom is actually a really carefully constructed narrative campaign that a number of actors who have vested interests in us not regulating greenhouse gas emissions, not stopping emissions, have developed over a long time. So some of the sort of earliest and best researched evidence for this comes from a paper that was written in 2017 by two academics called Naomi Oreskes and Jeffrey Supran. And they looked at what the oil company ExxonMobil knew about climate change. If you looked at their internal documentation, memos that were going around the company, versus what they were putting out there in the public domain. And it shows that there is a real disconnection between what Exxon knew internally, where they had sort of 80% or more certainty that climate change was happening, was a problem, and did need to be addressed, and what they were putting out in their public relations, where they were saying more than 80% of the time that it wasn't such a big issue and we didn't need to take very much action. And that's just one example. Another that I think is quite an important one is the actual, maybe some of you have heard about this idea of carbon footprints. So you normally go onto the internet and you calculate, if you probably can't drive yet, but do you drive a car? Do you eat meat? All of these different things. How many times do you fly a year? All of the different ways that individuals are contributing to climate change. And these are called carbon footprint calculators. And the first of these was actually developed by the oil company BP, which is now called Beyond Petroleum, but at the time was called British Petroleum. And BP's goal in creating this sort of way of understanding the carbon footprints of individuals was an effort to make everybody feel responsible for climate change, which to some extent we are, but to really shift the focus onto individual action and consumer choice rather than onto big overarching government interventions and regulations, which would of course impact the industry more rapidly than consumer choice could. And so the reason I connect this with this issue of climate anxiety is I think we need to really think critically about where our sources of despair and hopelessness come from. And they come in many ways from a man-made narrative, a narrative that some people have been very prominent in constructing in order to delay climate action. But because of that, I actually find that quite hopeful. Because if somebody has successfully created a narrative that says that we can't do anything about climate change other than change the way that we, what we eat for breakfast, then we can undo that narrative and we can start as a society talking about more constructive ways of moving forward. And this is something that's been pretty well recorded in the literature as actually working. So there are a number of people who talk about action as an antidote to climate anxiety, as the way to feel much better about the situation, because you are doing what you can to try and change some of the pervading issues that have stopped us from taking action thus far. And we already see a number of climate activists who have had a really influential impact on how we understand this issue, how we understand the gravity of this issue, and what governments are willing to do about it. So on the screen here, you have some pictures of some really fantastic youth climate activists. We have Vanessa Nakate, who's a Ugandan climate activist who recently wrote a really good book. We have Radhima Pandey, who is a very young climate activist from India, who has brought a number of legal challenges to the Indian government, and I'll talk more about that in a second. And we have Greta Thunberg and Luisa Neubauer, the Swedish and German activists who you may be familiar with, who have led the Fridays for Future school strikes movement. And what the work of collectively these and other activists has done is that it has really shifted the narrative. Like Andy can probably attest to this more than I can because he's been working on climate a lot longer. But in the past sort of 4 years, I've seen a massive shift in the way that decision makers and others are responding to this issue. And I think that's in large part attributable to the school strikers and to others who have been really calling attention to this and showing that there is a big public demand for action. So I reckon there's sort of many different ways to get involved in climate action, of course. There is attending protests. There's also engaging actively in political processes. We've seen some really interesting developments at the local level in local politics with councils making some massive progress on climate change, particularly here in the UK. And that's largely due to community activism and engagement. There is orientating your career to doing something on climate in the professional sphere. And of course, that might be relevant for some of you who are thinking about what you're going to do at university and how you might be able to use that to get future careers. You know, what Tess has just shown us is that companies are having to work to figure out how to change basically every aspect of their business models to respond to this issue. And in order to do that, they need large numbers of people who understand carbon accounting, who understand kind of how to assess climate risks and impacts. And so there's many, many ways in which people can engage in activism through the career paths that they choose. And then the final issue, which I'll talk a little bit about since it's my sort of specialist subject, is climate change litigation. So this is basically where young people and community groups and others are going to court to argue for more climate action from either governments or companies. And we see this phenomenon happening in more than 44 countries around the world. The most cases are in the US, which has more than 1,000 of the 2,000 cases that we've recorded. But this is happening all over the place now. And one of the things that's quite interesting about this is that it's a relatively successful approach to getting more ambition on climate change. And I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that my background is doing strategic litigation, which is the kind of litigation that NGOs do, that people do when they want to grab headlines and change public debates about a given issue. So they want to win in court, they want to get a court order that says that whoever their target is has to do whatever they want, but they also want to raise awareness and change narratives. And over time, my colleagues and I have tracked that strategic litigation on climate change has been rapidly on the rise. So we see now nearly all of the climate change litigation cases that are being filed are filed with these broader societal goals. And that's led the IPCC, which is that scientific body that Andy mentioned, to recognize the impact that this is having, this approach that just NGOs and community groups are taking is actually having on climate governance. So that's quite a powerful testament to how important this is. One of the reasons why this is so important is because by going to court, you have the opportunity to reshuffle power relations to some extent between communities and governments. So I won't talk, because I'm conscious of time, I won't talk about all of the cases on this slide, but here you have a selection of campaigns and cases that were led by young people, by sort of massive crowd-funded campaigns and by community groups that have successfully managed to persuade courts and tribunals to take action and order governments or companies to do more on climate change. And one of the things that going to court does that I think is not offered by many other avenues is that it, to some extent, puts those people who are concerned about climate change and its impacts on the same kind of footing as governments and companies who normally would just ignore your emails and not let you get in a room. And the sort of one example that I'll talk about is case on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a case brought by Luisa Neubauer, one of those activists that I showed standing with Greta Thunberg, and a number of other German young people. And they argued that Germany's climate protection law, which was largely considered a pretty good and pretty ambitious law by people in the policy community, was A, not ambitious enough, and B, it was unfair in the way that it split the burden of taking action on climate change between this decade and decades in the future. And they argued that because the law was reluctant to impose big changes in the way that we live in the short term, they were placing a really unfair burden on young people to make those adaptations even quicker in the longer term. So I'll stop there. I can talk about many more examples if you're interested after this. But those are just some of the points that I wanted to cover. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Now, I think there are like a million questions now floating through my head, and I'm sure there are through everyone else's as well. So please do use the chat to put down your questions, and but just to kick it off while you're all thinking, I think I'll throw this one perhaps Andy to start off with, but then we can pass it around. Do you think, I mean, you've been involved in government decision making with climate change. Do you think that particular types of government are more likely to be able to implement policies to reduce carbon emissions?
What do you mean by different types of government, Guy?
Well, I'm thinking, for example, of, say, China versus the US.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. So kind of the level of democracy, if they're getting good advice, then I think organizations quite often see either the potential or the threat of climate change. So So my understanding is that China is really throwing itself into manufacturing wind turbines, because I mean, that is a huge opportunity for the future. And even though in the United States, we saw a slowing down of national action on climate change in the Trump years, that didn't stop states and companies taking action. Particularly the military in the United States sees the huge threat that climate change causes. I mean, they'll essentially get a new border with the removal of the Arctic ice sheets, sea ice rather. So there's a huge threat there, as well as destabilization around the world. So yeah, I suppose it has been led by developed democracies in the West largely, but then, I mean, everyone's getting involved now. The small island developing states are very, very active because they see the huge threat it has to them. Yeah, do either of the other presenters want to jump in as well?
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting question, and there's some interesting empirical research that has looked at whether democracies or autocracies do better on climate action. And it seems that the main thing that makes a difference is actually not the type of government you have, but the level of economic prosperity in a country at a given time. So the more prosperous a country is, the more rapid the climate action that it's taking is likely to be. Now, arguably, that's probably because that country has more resources to put into the issue, but that's the only thing that we can say for certain. I think one thing that's interesting to think about in terms of the difference between the way that different systems might respond to the issue is to bring in the question of what we refer to as the just transition. So basically, whether or not the measures that we put in place to deal with climate change are impacting on some communities and people more than on others. And it may be that you find that in developed democracies, it is more possible and also more necessary to really take just transition considerations into account when designing climate policy to make sure that they stick than it is in some autocracies. But that's a bit of speculation on my part.
Tess, do you have anything to add?
I guess I can add a bit of empirics to it as well. So I think in terms of the companies that we assess, there are some notable regional patterns that we see. So it's probably more of an output of what Kate was just describing. But a lot of our companies that we assess in India and China and a lot of these emerging economies we observe worse carbon performance in terms of their emissions intensities over time, especially in the more energy intensive sectors like oil and gas and electric utilities. They're a lot more coal-based. So, I mean, this is obviously, again, speculative, but I think it's obvious, like there's likely a priority of increasing the standard of living over addressing climate action as the primary focus. But that's in general what we see from those regional discrepancies in carbon performance across certain demographics.
Okay, well, to follow that, I mean, that's a very interesting kind of connection you're making between, you know, the need for development and carbon emissions. Do you think, to keep the question with Tess for a moment, the West, you know, we have historically emitted more carbon than anyone else by a huge factor. Do we have to own that, and should we be making bigger sacrifices than other people?
This is another, I think, big issue that the Paris Agreement touches on, which is that concept of common but differentiated responsibility. So as a global issue, we all need to kind of step up and reduce emissions where possible and decarbonize quickly. But there's a large question of who owns the most responsibility. Should it be those countries that have historically had greater responsibility for emissions, or should it be those that have more accessible low carbon opportunities to reduce emissions in the near term, those who are more financially able to? And I think this is a large debate going on kind of in the more geopolitical landscape as well. But I don't think there's a clear answer about who should take on more responsibility. I mean, I don't want to take an opinion on it, but I think a lot of the more developed countries that have the, I guess, financial ability to address these issues more as a primary consideration, and development as a secondary, I suppose. I think there's a lot of research onto what direction those financial flows should go to empower more emerging economies start decarbonizing as well. So I'll leave it at that. I feel like Andy and Kate probably have a lot to say about it.
Yeah, maybe while we're waiting for the audience, I really do encourage people to ask questions. I mean, this is a fantastic opportunity to ask any question you like, and there is no such thing as a silly question. So please do post questions into the chat. Maybe I'll ask each of the panel if they'd like to ask each other questions. I mean, maybe Kate, do you have anything you'd like to ask Andy about the science of it, for example?
I'd love to ask Andy about his time working with the Climate Change Committee, and I think you said you worked on the adaptation side when you were working there. Adaptation is what we call the ways that we change what we're doing to respond to climate impacts rather than mitigation, which is where we reduce emissions. But Andy, I'd be interested to hear whether you, whether you think that based on your work, we are well prepared as the UK for dealing with climate impacts, or what you would sort of see as the biggest challenges going forwards as well.
Yes, so it is bad news, I'm afraid. The adaptation side of the Committee on Climate Change that I worked on, we publish a progress report every 2 years, and I wrote the flooding and coastal erosion sections of the 2019 one, and I still, I know the other ones really well. And when the 2021 report came out, there was a really damning assessment that climate risks had increased faster than climate adaptation had between those two reports. So between 2019 and 2021, we essentially went backwards because climate change is getting worse faster than we're doing anything about it. I think there are a lot of problems in the process. Ministers keep changing. So, we used to get a new minister, we'd go and chat with them, they would get them up to speed, they would understand things. There was a really positive example where I wrote a report on coastal adaptation. So what's going to happen to our coastal towns with rising sea level and coastal erosion and more coastal flooding. And when Michael Gove was the environment minister, he actually used some of my words at the launch of something that's inconsequential. But I mean, that was great that we talked about how resilience and climate change adaptation has to move into this new phase. And he used some of the same words that we were using in our report. And then, we're at least one environment minister on from him. George Eustace has been around for a while, but he was never particularly engaged. But then there are the ministers below the Secretary of State as well, and they change a lot. The adaptation minister kept changing, and you get them interested. Like we were doing really good work with Lord Gardner on an insurance for coastal erosion. So if the coast erodes and your house falls off a cliff, you get nothing. You get a bill to clean it up sometimes. It's not like flooding where you're covered by insurance. And we did start making some progress, saying this is a big problem and it's going to get much, much bigger. So present day, there are around 3,000 to 5,000 coastal properties that are at risk of coastal erosion. By the end of this century, that could be as high as 200,000. So we're building up this, another time bomb, a coastal time bomb of all this risk that we just don't have managed. But as a job, it was really exciting. I mean, being on the real cutting edge of where policy was being developed, picking holes in government policy, being really well respected internationally. I mean, the Climate Change Act and the Committee on Climate Change have been the model for climate change legislation around the world. I can see a question's come in. So are you going to jump in on that, Guy?
I'm going to jump in on that. And actually, I think has asked a really good question that's following on from what you were just saying about sort of lack of action, really, which is what are the main factors that affect action being taken as quickly as it should be? In other words, what's stopping it?
Shall I jump in on a quick one there, and then I can see Kate's itching to come in. So I think it's that things have to be flattering the ego of the people making the decisions. So, you know, wind farms, big infrastructure projects that have immediate impact on greenhouse gas emissions, ministers love that. They get to open something, they get to see something. Whereas insulating homes would have had a huge impact if we'd have done that 10 years ago. Given the current crisis we're in with fuel costs, that would have been a brilliant move. But we messed it up because it's just not that interesting. No one gets to grandstand about, you know, a rollout of insulation across the country, even though it would have huge impacts on emissions, jobs, you know, green growth, all those things. And adaptation, the problem is you don't get the benefits for many, many years, possibly decades, if at all. I mean, the problem with risk is something might not happen, but you still want to be prepared for it. So you could get accused of wasting money if you build defences and then the flood never comes. I'll hand over.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in there, and I completely agree with Andy that adaptation in particular has a real problem in attracting the attention of decision makers, because you're planning to avoid a situation where you have big photo ops of you know, politicians wading around in wellies or whatever, having visited a flood. There are no photo ops if you've adapted well. There is just also no flood. But I think one of the things that, or there's a couple of things I would say about sort of action at the international level, and then the way that we see this playing out in domestic policies. So one of the big questions at the international level has been about, is the question that Tess was talking about, really, who is responsible for acting on climate change? And there has been a major reluctance, really, on the part of Western developed governments to acknowledge the degree to which, as contributors to climate change and also as the sort of people that have benefited the most from industrialization, those nations need to reduce emissions. And that has then led to conflict with emerging and underdeveloped economies that have said, well, if you're not doing it, why should we? So that's one of the dynamics that we see playing out. There's also the point that I raised about sort of disinformation and vested interests. And I think it's worth knowing that in the US, in the 90s, there was a really big push for climate action by the then Democratic government, the Democrat Party, not the then Democratic government as compared to now, although we could debate that. And the Democrats launched a public awareness campaign calling for more support for climate action in the face of big opposition from Republican states and from corporations. And what actually happened through that process is that people became more polarized. After the Democrats' big public awareness campaign, you actually saw fewer Republicans supporting climate action than they had in the first place. And I think that sort of just illustrates the real difficulty of acting on an issue that affects all of us, but which is very easily politicized because of the way that it involves distributing costs and benefits and burdens.
Okay, that's brilliant. I'm gonna rather than pass this one on to Tess, I'm just looking at the time, and somehow an hour has slipped past unbelievably quickly. What I'm going to suggest is that we take the last question from Michelle and slightly broaden it, and anyone who'd like to stay, if the panel can spare another 5-10 minutes, we'll just quickly whiz round a slightly broader version of that question. So the question is glass a pragmatic approach towards preventing melting of ice? But let's broaden that slightly to what people see as the greatest hopes in the areas that that you're working in, where you see the great tech hopes for solutions. Maybe we start with Tess. What do you think companies tech-wise are doing that will produce the biggest effects?
I think so. The approach that we take at the Transition Pathway Initiative is sectoral. So I think there's sectors that have more accessible and lower cost options that are more feasible to implement quicker than others. So for example, oil and gas and cement and steel are harder to abate sectors. So in those sectors, it's harder to reduce emissions because the very nature of what they produce require a lot of energy and a lot of emissions through heat and steam to produce cement and steel. So I think some of the patterns that we've seen in the past couple of years, when we look at in aggregate all of the sectors that we assess, it's that electric utilities and autos have some of the most accessible technologies at their disposal that would offer low cost options to transition. So in the automotive sector, that would be electric vehicles. And then in the electric utility sector, that's more about decarbonizing the grid. So coming off of more energy or emissions intensive forms of fuel, so coal, and transitioning into more renewables, obviously, in the grid. So I think that's one of the main patterns I've seen from a more sectoral basis. Yeah.
Thanks, Tess. I have to say, electric vehicles make me despair. I mean, I think I'm a child of the 70s where there was Citroen produced a 2CV that was a light economical car that used hardly any petrol, and there just doesn't seem to be electric versions of that. They're bloody, Teslas using vast amounts of energy and going incredibly quickly, and there's something really wrong with the way we're building electric cars.
Right.
And Andy, what do you think about what do you see as the tech?
Could I qualify my electric vehicle thing for one
moment? Including bikes and...
Because you brought up a really good point, guys. It was just that there's a large part of the electric vehicle manufacturing value chain that's kind of oftentimes overlooked, which is the upstream that requires a lot of these sort of metals that are more emissions intensive. So a lot of the upstream that electric vehicle manufacturers don't necessarily have to take ownership of, but somebody does. So yeah, it's not a perfect industry at all. Okay.
Yeah, shall I jump in now? I think the thing that would have the biggest impact is if we change our mindset, not necessarily cross our fingers and hope for a tech solution out of it. We shouldn't accept rubbish housing. We should demand that houses are properly insulated, are easily to transition to another method of heating, be that hydrogen or heat pumps, that they are flood resilient, that we don't expect to be able to fly as much as we do, that cars come at a huge cost and maybe we don't need to own one ourselves, that could be pooled. Yeah, so I suppose nuclear fusion, scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere, those sorts of things, people are working on them, and if they work, that'd be brilliant. But I think if everyone changed the way they thought about this problem, then we'd be a long way to solving it.
Do you think they're likely to, or will they need to be compelled to?
I don't know. I think we're seeing a shift in mindset. Things like XR and Friday strikes, and even Insulate Britain. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the way that they go about what they do, but the fact that there is a pressure group who campaign vociferously for insulation is unbelievable. If you told me that was going to happen 10 years ago, I would not have believed you.
Okay, what do you see any tech solutions?
I mean, I agree with Andy. We have a number of tech solutions, as Tess has just been talking about, ways for different sectors and industries to transition. And what we need now is really political will to do that, and to persuade people that changing the way that we do things now is going to be better than being forced to change them much more radically in the future. And I think we do see that, and I mean, one of the things that I find endlessly hopeful is, also the way in which people are starting to say it is mandatory to do this. That's partly because of legislation, people changing laws, governments passing laws that require companies and government departments to take more action on climate change, but it's also partly through courts using existing legal systems and applying them to the issue of climate change and saying, well, actually, the duty that a company like Shell owes to everybody else not to harm them, which is a legal duty that is established in most legal systems. You can't just run someone over in the street without, paying them some kind of reparations for that. That applies in the context of climate change. And so we saw earlier, or last year in May, an incredible judgment coming out of the Netherlands, the Hague District Court, in which they said Shell has to reduce its emissions by to net zero by 2050 and radically by 2030, which was huge. So I think we are going to see that kind of compulsion coming in, but it may not be directed at individuals, but at corporations to advance the kind of work that Tess has already been telling us about.
I mean, I really I would love to continue this discussion, because I feel personally, you look at something like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there is no intrinsic reason why the law should move in a progressive direction, and it could easily move in an opposite direction. But that's something for a longer discussion, I think. I want to say thank you all to our panel, but also thanks to our audience on a really hot Monday night. I think one person dropped out when we went over the hour, and everyone stayed here. So thank you all very much for patiently sitting in what must be very hot conditions everywhere, and hearing a fantastic extension lecture. So without further ado, I'll thank our panel and say good evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Guy. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye now.